I didn't think it would feel like someone was walking just behind me until the second night offshore, and by then it was too late to convince myself it was imagination. The floodlights above the deck didn't illuminate enough to see the sea properly, and the horizon seemed unnervingly flat, like the world had stopped moving except for me. I kept thinking I could hear faint replies to my own movements, subtle hesitations in the echoes that made me flinch and pull my jacket tighter around my shoulders. That's when I remembered that there were 11 strange rules. Everyone on the platform supposedly followed to survive, though nobody ever explained them aloud, and I knew I'd already broken one without realizing it. I tried to shake off the panic, telling myself I was tired, overthinking the isolation, but the chill creeping through my collarbone whispered otherwise, and I found myself wishing the night would just end. Rule 1. Never respond to echoes after midnight, even if they sound like you. I remembered the words clearly that first night when the sound of my boots returned offbeat against the metal grating. I had thought it was a normal reflection at first, the wind shifting just so, until I realized the echo was waiting, stretching, like it was considering whether to follow me or not. The thought made my stomach tighten, and I paused mid-step, pretending to check my tools while the sound lingered longer than physics should have allowed. Each careful breath felt heavy in my chest, and I kept repeating the rule in my head, hoping that sheer repetition could act like a shield. I moved slowly toward the stairwell leading to the lower maintenance decks, eyes darting to shadows that shouldn't have existed. Every bolt and railing seemed to hum, resonating in a way that made the platform feel alive, aware, listening. I tried to recall the routine the senior techs had drilled into us, how they avoided unnecessary conversation during late hours, and I realized that even small movements could trigger attention. The echo's timing was never exact. It bent around corners and surfaces, sometimes appearing seconds before I even made a noise. My hands shook as I set down the wrench, every instinct screaming that acknowledging the sound might have consequences. The ventilation ducts carried a faint metallic draft that made my skin crawl as I crouched near a panel to inspect a pressure gauge. I could hear the echo of my own voice from hours earlier, faintly calling out to a coworker who wasn't there. I thought about laughing it off, telling myself I was imagining things, but the weight of the emptiness pressed against my mind. Shadows lengthened across the deck, subtly twisting in ways the dim lights shouldn't allow. Rule 1. Never respond to echoes after midnight, even if they sound like you kept looping through my head. Each repetition a reminder of the one thing I had no choice but to obey, and yet the temptation to speak, to answer, gnawed at my resolve. I took another step toward the stairwell, feeling the floorboards vibrate faintly under my boots, a rhythm almost too deliberate to be natural. The echo had shifted, now repeating the soft scrape of metal, like it was mocking my hesitancy. I stopped, listening closely, heart hammering, mind trying to rationalize each minor vibration, every faint footfall that wasn't mine. It was impossible to tell if the sound was external, or somehow inside me, originating in my thoughts and becoming reality. My chest tightened, and I whispered to myself, "Don't respond," though the wind carried the echo's mimicry closer, taunting me with possibilities. By the time I reached the lower maintenance deck, I could see the shadows pooling in corners, bending unnaturally around piping and machinery. I leaned against a railing, trying to steady my hands and breathing, counting silently to maintain a thread of normalcy. The echo now seemed deliberate, stretching syllables, as though considering what it might say if I spoke first. I remembered the posted rules taped inside the locker doors, faded marker lines under oil stains, and the first one stood out with brutal clarity. I could almost see the letters hover in front of me, though it was just my exhaustion making shapes in the dim light, warning me that Rule 1, never respond to echoes after midnight, even if they sound like you, was absolute. Time became slippery as I continued my inspection, each moment stretching unnaturally, the echo's intervals never consistent. I crouched to check a valve, feeling the cold steel bite through my gloves, and realized I had been holding my breath for several seconds without noticing. My mind flinched every time the echo shifted, now mimicking the faint tapping I made against the panel, and I fought the urge to call out in reassurance. The platform felt less like metal and machinery, and more like a living thing, observing, calculating, punishing any slip in vigilance. I gripped the edge of the panel, reminding myself over and over that obeying the rule was the only thing standing between me and whatever lingered in the dark. I moved along the narrow catwalk, every step measured, every movement deliberate, listening for the pattern in the sounds that shouldn't exist. The echo now seemed to pause in anticipation, creating a gap just long enough to make me question if I had imagined it. I felt my mind stretch thin, paranoia burrowing into the spaces between thoughts, forcing me to replay my training and the warnings of technicians who had worked here longer than I had. I touched the wall lightly, grounding myself, pretending the vibrations were just mechanical, but the echo wasn't mechanical. It was testing me, and the clarity of Rule 1, never respond to echoes after midnight, even if they sound like you, became the only mental anchor I had left. Even the familiar hum of the platform's engines seemed off, a subtle warble that synchronized with the echo in ways that made my stomach churn. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, that I had been at sea too long isolated, and that fatigue was warping perception. But the echo followed, stretching across corridors and ducts, aligning itself with the exact pitch of my own hesitant voice. I whispered the words of the rule under my breath, almost chanting, almost pleading, because the thought of breaking it made the hairs on my neck rise. The warning wasn't just advice, it felt alive, a living guideline that demanded obedience. The stairwell to the storage bay creaked beneath my careful steps, shadows flickering as my flashlight swung, and I realized that the echo had started to take shape differently in my mind. It wasn't merely sound, it carried intent, teasing possibilities, offering suggestions that I was too terrified to entertain. My reflection in the metal panels seemed wrong, slightly delayed, and I froze, imagining my own face answering the echo back. The temptation to speak was like a pulse through my veins, and I held tighter to the rule, murmuring Rule 1, never respond to echoes after midnight, even if they sound like you, feeling it steady my mind just enough to continue. Hours passed in this suspended awareness, each task extending infinitely, my body obeying while my mind spun small narratives about what the echo might want. I checked gauges, retightened bolts, and performed maintenance in silence, acutely aware that the platform's machinery could be turned against me if I faltered. I realized that the echoes didn't just replicate sound, they anticipated hesitation, lingering, shaping fear into tangible pressure against my chest. I kept repeating the rule internally, its repetition like a shield, a mantra to protect the fragile barrier between reality and the unknown, though my consciousness quivered with every step. Toward the end of the deck, the shadows seemed to collect in corners, stretching unnaturally along piping and walls, making me wonder if the platform itself was complicit. I avoided looking too directly at them, moving with deliberate slowness, careful to avoid triggering a response. The echo now resembled the sound of my own breathing, but offset by a fraction, a cruel mimicry meant to test my will. I clenched my jaw, reminded myself that this was isolation, paranoia, fatigue, and nothing more, but even as I said it, the sensation of being observed persisted, pressing insistently. Rule 1, never respond to echoes after midnight, even if they sound like you, remained my only lifeline as I approached the end of the maintenance bay. By the time I reached the storage bay, exhaustion weighed down every limb, and I felt a subtle shiver creep across my shoulders. The echo followed, patient, stretching, bending, always a half step behind, yet somehow anticipating my thoughts. I realized that obeying the rule wasn't just a precaution, it was the only thing preventing the platform itself from becoming a trap. I paused, hand on the hatch, staring at the dim corridor ahead, and understood that the echo wasn't just a reflection of sound, but a measure of my control, my hesitation, my fear. Holding fast to Rule 1, never respond to echoes after midnight, even if they sound like you, became a silent act of survival, as fragile and essential as the air in my lungs. Rule 2. Always check the ventilation shafts for obstructions. no matter how trivial they seem. I remembered fumbling with the flashlight near the lower maintenance deck, when the cold draft hit my face at an odd angle, making me notice the grates above were slightly misaligned. At first I thought it was just fatigue messing with my perception, but a subtle shift of shadow inside one of the vents caught my eye. I knelt down, crouching so that my head was almost level with the metal grill, and peered in, trying to convince myself that nothing could possibly be wrong. The stillness inside felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to look away before whatever lived there decided to move. I gritted my teeth, thinking of the second rule posted in the locker, and whispered it to myself, letting it anchor my focus in the midst of mounting unease. I traced the length of the vent with my flashlight, noting how even the smallest bump or misalignment could have consequences I didn't fully understand. The air smelled faintly metallic, carrying a scent that reminded me of rust mixed with the brine from outside, but it also had something else I couldn't name, subtle and unsettling. I hesitated, fingers brushing against the grated edges, because the last time I ignored something small like this, the maintenance logs had quietly suggested that an incident had been narrowly avoided. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to rationalize it as a harmless draft, but I remembered Rule 2. Always check the ventilation shafts for obstructions, no matter how trivial they seem, and forced myself to pry open a section of the grill just enough to look inside. The blackness seemed to pulse, as if the vent itself was breathing. Crawling along the narrow catwalk, with my flashlight angled into every vent along the way, I began to notice tiny accumulations of grime that didn't belong, dust patterns that had been subtly disturbed, and a faint glimmer in the shadows that looked unnervingly like something watching. I convinced myself it was debris, the platform settling, my mind playing tricks in isolation, but a subtle sound, a tap that couldn't have been mechanical, made me freeze. I pulled back the vent cover slightly, peering in as carefully as I could, the metal cool under my gloves, and felt a tickle of fear that had nothing to do with exhaustion. The silence inside the vents was absolute, but somehow heavier, as though it pressed against my eardrums, and I had the unnerving sensation that my presence had been expected. Each careful inspection of the ducts became a test of nerve, a slow unraveling of my certainty that nothing on this platform could surprise me. I followed the vents toward the storage bay, noticing how airflow seemed to bend unnaturally, almost intentionally directing the draft toward certain areas of the deck. Every inch I inspected made the metal framework feel less familiar, as if it had been subtly rearranged overnight. My flashlight reflected briefly on something that shouldn't have been there, a shadow too rigid to be a flicker or misalignment, and I had to stop breathing for a moment to steady my pulse. I reminded myself of the rule again in my head, Rule 2. Always check the ventilation shafts for obstructions, no matter how trivial they seem, feeling its weight like a tether that kept me focused. It wasn't about logic anymore, it was about obedience, about staying alert to things that were small, almost invisible, but capable of consequences I didn't fully understand. By the time I reached the main junction vent, I was crouched low, prying at the grate with gloved fingers, while imagining what might be inside. Dust shifted with a subtle pattern, as if something moved just beyond the reach of my light, watching and calculating. I could feel my own heartbeat echoing in my ears, competing with the rhythmic hum of the platform's engines. The vent seemed to narrow as I shined my light deeper, the shadows within pooling and twisting unnaturally. My hands shook slightly, and I thought about the technicians who had quietly warned me about the importance of small checks, the kind nobody would notice until it was too late. The second rule wasn't optional, it was a survival guideline woven into the fabric of this place, a line between order and chaos. I pulled the cover fully open to examine the interior, noting a strange coil of cable that hadn't been there during my last inspection. It lay oddly, partially lodged against the side of the shaft, almost as though it had been placed intentionally. I debated ignoring it, rationalizing that nothing could crawl through a vent this narrow, but the instinct that isolation breeds paranoia whispered insistently that the smallest obstruction could matter more than I realized. I carefully removed it, inspecting the vent along its full length, noting how even tiny debris could shift the airflow and create pockets of unseen tension. My pulse quickened, and I imagined the consequences of failing this rule, of leaving something trivial unexamined, while the darkness inside seemed to stretch with a patient intent. Continuing along the network of shafts, I noticed that some had condensation dripping in ways that didn't align with the platform's systems. The water collected along certain seams, forming tiny rivulets that reflected the flashlight in eerie patterns. I hesitated, crouched and straining to see into the far reaches of the vent, the rule's words looping silently in my head. A tiny shadow moved in one of the side ducts, slow and deliberate, just beyond the reach of my beam. My imagination immediately leapt to possibilities I didn't want to consider, the kind that made the hair on my neck stand on end. Following the guidance of Rule 2, always check the ventilation shafts for obstructions, no matter how trivial they seem, I inched closer, prying and peering, fully aware that neglecting this could invite consequences far beyond simple mechanical failure. As I moved to the final section of ducts near the generator room, I noticed a subtle vibration in the metal walls that didn't match the hum of the engines. It was faint, irregular, and somehow purposeful, as if it was synchronized with my steps. I crouched, bracing myself against the metal frame, flashlight probing each corner, mentally reviewing every maintenance note I could remember. The air in the vent shifted, carrying a faint metallic scent, and I felt my muscles tighten in anticipation. I reminded myself once more of the rule, Rule 2, always check the ventilation shafts for obstructions, no matter how trivial they seem, because ignoring it had never been an option, and the platform made that abundantly clear in the subtle pressures and whispers that isolation breeds. The final stretch of venting led me past pipes that seemed to hum differently than before, carrying drafts in irregular pulses. I leaned closer, checking for any signs of obstruction or debris, carefully noting even the smallest variations in temperature or airflow. My mind strained to differentiate between imagination and reality, every shadow and reflection feeling alive, like they were observing my movements. I had to remind myself to breathe steadily, to move slowly, to honor the rule that had already proven its worth through the subtle warnings and misalignments I had discovered. Each careful inspection reinforced that the smallest seemingly trivial obstruction could escalate into consequences I wasn't ready to face. By the time I finished the full circuit of the ventilation system, I felt a lingering tension in my shoulders, a subtle dread that didn't dissipate even after confirming the shafts were clear. I could feel the echo of my own footsteps in the ducts, subtle, uneven, almost responsive in a way that made me pause and listen. The rule had anchored me through each check, a steady guideline in the otherwise chaotic and isolating environment of the platform. I straightened up, aware that the night was still far from over, that vigilance was continuous, and that Rule 2's lesson would haunt every step I took along these decks in the dark hours that followed. Rule 3. Never ignore the subtle shifts in lighting. They are warnings in disguise. I noticed it first as a faint flicker along the corridor near the storage bay, almost too small to register, like a brief hesitation in the fluorescent hum overhead. At first I told myself it was just the wiring, an irregularity in the old systems of the platform. But the instinct to pause crept in, whispering that the light was trying to tell me something. I squinted, adjusting my helmet light to compensate, and the shadows bent differently than before, pooling in corners as if they were aware of my gaze. My chest tightened as I remembered the rule, murmuring it to myself like a quiet prayer, letting its presence slow my frantic thoughts, just enough to force attention on every shift, however trivial it seemed. As I moved along the deck, the subtle changes became more pronounced, lights dimming and brightening in ways that weren't consistent with timers or power fluctuations. My steps slowed, each footfall deliberate, because I had learned through experience that ignoring these changes invited consequences that couldn't be predicted. I crouched to check a valve while my peripheral vision caught shadows twitching unnaturally at the edges of my sight. Even the reflective metal of the railings seemed to warp in response, exaggerating angles and depth in a way that made the platform feel less familiar, almost sentient. The rule insisted I observe, but the isolation made it difficult to distinguish between perception and paranoia, and yet I obeyed, because hesitation could be fatal. The overhead lights flickered again as I approached the junction to the upper maintenance corridors, and I could feel a subtle pressure building in the air, as though the shift in illumination had altered the very atmosphere. I leaned against the wall, tracing the faint gradients with my eyes, noting every slight difference in glow and shadow. Something about the flicker carried intent. It wasn't random. I felt my pulse quicken, and even as I reminded myself to breathe, the rule echoed in my mind, guiding my observation with unnerving precision. The platform seemed to respond to my awareness, the lights bending to test whether I was paying attention, and I realized that neglecting even minor changes could invite unseen consequences. I continued along the narrow catwalk leading toward the generator room, the dim emergency lighting casting long, thin shadows across machinery I had walked past countless times. The shifts became subtle signals, a panel appearing darker here, a doorway slightly more illuminated there. I crouched to inspect a junction box, flashlight angled to catch hidden details, but the shadows seemed to stretch toward me, reluctant to stay put. My mind raced, trying to separate reality from fatigue, the rule repeating like a mantra in the background. Rule 3. Never ignore the subtle shifts in lighting. They are warnings in disguise. Each pulse of light or shadow made me flinch, and I realized my own body had begun anticipating the next change before it happened. Near the storage bay vent, the lighting warped once more, elongating shadows along the catwalk in impossible directions, creating spaces where none should exist. I forced myself to step carefully, examining reflections and bends in the metal surfaces, aware that ignoring these signals could mean stepping into a hazard I couldn't anticipate. The faint hum of the engine seemed to fluctuate in tandem with the changes above, creating a rhythm that pressed against my eardrums and made my stomach clench. The isolation magnified everything. The subtlety of the rule became terrifying because any lapse might be met with consequences the platform didn't announce. I paused, noting every gradient, every flicker, every bend, because survival demanded no shortcuts. I crouched under the stairwell leading to the lower decks, flashlight sweeping the edges of the railing, as shadows twisted and merged in the corners of my vision. Each flicker and shift carried a warning I couldn't interpret fully, yet instinct screamed that I needed to heed it. The rule wasn't about lights themselves. It was about paying attention to changes that seemed inconsequential until they weren't. I traced the overhead fixtures, noting differences in brightness across spans of just a few feet, tiny enough to be ignored by anyone else but impossible for me to overlook. The platform seemed almost alive in these moments, subtle and patient, waiting to see whether I would recognize the significance of every hint. Passing the main generator, I noticed that one of the emergency lights pulsed faintly, brighter and dimmer in a pattern almost too slow to notice. I crouched, flashlight angled to examine the vents and nearby panels, and the shadows appeared to stretch unnaturally, accentuating the depth between supports. I reminded myself that Rule 3, never ignore the subtle shifts in lighting, they are warnings in disguise, wasn't optional. It was the difference between noticing danger and being caught unaware. The isolation had twisted perception, making everything feel more menacing, and I realized that the smallest change, almost imperceptible, carried more weight than any mechanical hazard I had encountered before. In the upper maintenance corridor, I traced the flickering shadows along the railing, noticing how they seemed to anticipate my movement, bending ahead of me just enough to create doubt in my own perception. I crouched low to inspect a vent, flashlight pointed, trying to ignore the subtle shiver running down my spine. The lights above warped slightly, elongating, bending corners in ways impossible in reality, yet I had to take them seriously. Observing each anomaly became a careful ritual, the rule acting as a guide, an anchor, something tangible amidst the oppressive uncertainty of the night. The platform was quiet, almost patient, but the subtle warnings in the lighting felt as deliberate as a whispered message in the dark. I leaned against a control panel near the generator, flashlight sweeping across the floor and ceiling, as small changes in light angles created strange, shifting shadows. Every movement seemed magnified, every flicker noticed, every gradient a subtle signal. The mental strain of following the rule built steadily, isolating me further as my focus narrowed to the bare essentials: movement, light, and shadows. I noticed that even a passing hand or misplaced tool could change the interplay of darkness and illumination, creating signals I had to interpret. The patience required to honor the rule made my muscles ache, my vision sharpen, and my mind fray at the edges. At the junction leading back to the catwalk over the storage bay, I crouched again, flashlight sweeping the area meticulously, noting how tiny shifts in the overhead lighting exaggerated depth and distance. I forced myself to step slowly, carefully, adjusting to subtle gradients in brightness, each shadow a potential indicator of danger or misalignment. My pulse thrummed in rhythm with the quiet hum of the platform, and I realized that ignoring these shifts could allow hazards to become accidents, or worse. The rule was no longer abstract, it was a living guideline, a protective lens through which I filtered every visual stimulus. I continued inching forward, fully aware that each misstep could be magnified in the isolation of the night. Finally, near the exit to the upper platform, I traced the last subtle changes, noticing how the shadows and illumination interacted with every surface differently. The platform felt like it breathed with me, each pulse of light sinking to my own heightened awareness. I had followed every gradient, every flicker, every imperceptible shift with deliberate attention, guided by the rule's quiet insistence. The isolation made every minor change feel amplified, as if the lights themselves were silently judging my observation, testing whether I had internalized the principle fully. By the time I paused to collect myself, the lesson of Rule 3 had been etched into my awareness, a silent thread running through the deck, connecting shadows, light, and vigilance in a delicate, uneasy balance. Rule 4. Never touch the machinery at night unless absolutely necessary, even if it seems harmless. I learned this the hard way. Crouched near the generator panel, when a faint vibration ran through the metal deck beneath my boots. My flashlight traced the pipes and panels, revealing minor adjustments that seemed trivial: an unsecured bolt, a slightly ajar valve, but my instincts screamed at me to leave everything alone. I could feel the echo of the platform's hum reverberating against my spine, subtle and insistent, like it was warning me not to interfere. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the lever, and murmured the rule to myself, letting its weight anchor my actions against the creeping temptation to fix something that wasn't broken. The deck seemed unnervingly quiet, the machinery cold and metallic in the dim light, and every small shift in temperature made the metal hum differently, heightening my awareness of the rule. I remembered stories from the senior technicians about nights when people had disregarded minor irregularities and found themselves trapped, or worse, though details were always sparse, intentionally vague. The vibration beneath me pulsed in rhythm with my own heartbeat, and I realized the platform responded subtly to touch, even in the smallest doses. I carefully adjusted my stance, keeping my hands away from the controls, and focused on observing the system instead of interacting, aware that the line between harmless curiosity and fatal mistake was thinner than I had imagined. As I moved along the catwalk, I noticed the machinery lining the walls seemed to shift in shadows I couldn't fully trust. Pipes appeared bent at impossible angles, panels reflected my light unevenly, and gauges blinked faintly in ways that weren't consistent with normal operation. Every instinct urged me to touch something, to test it, to ensure it was working, but I remembered Rule 4, never touch the machinery at night unless absolutely necessary, even if it seems harmless, and forced my hands into my pockets. Even a minor adjustment could trigger something unpredictable. The platform's silence was deceptive, and I had learned from experience that quiet nights often carried the most danger. I crouched near a valve that had a subtle leak, the metal slick under my gloves, and fought the impulse to twist it shut. The hiss of escaping air was faint, almost polite, but my imagination filled in the spaces between the sounds, whispering of consequences I couldn't see. The lights above flickered subtly, elongating shadows across the machinery, and I realized that even observation could heighten the tension, as if the platform itself noted my focus. I remained still, hands away from anything I could manipulate, breathing slowly, heart tight in my chest, knowing that obeying the rule didn't feel protective, It felt like survival against a living, patient presence that wanted to see my mistakes. Near the junction to the storage bay, the pumps and valves emitted small vibrations I had initially dismissed, but now seemed significant, resonating in a pattern almost too deliberate to be random. I leaned close, careful not to touch, tracing my flashlight along gauges and pipes, trying to anticipate which movements might escalate the vibrations into something uncontrollable. My mind ran through prior incidents, where minor tampering had resulted in small malfunctions that escalated into dangerous mechanical issues, but the vague nature of those stories made me imagine far worse consequences than had actually occurred. Every small adjustment I resisted reinforced the importance of the rule, a silent thread keeping my hands and instincts in check, even as the platform seemed to whisper temptations toward error. I crouched beside a control panel that had a faint flicker in its lights, unsure whether the subtle irregularity was electrical or psychological. I traced the edges with my flashlight, noting how tiny shifts in shadows could alter the perception of control knobs and switches. My hands twitched involuntarily toward the levers, and I caught myself pressing them into my pockets instead, forcing my mind back to the principle embedded in the rule. The hum of the machinery seemed to amplify in my ears, as if conscious of my hesitation, and I realized that even minor contact could ripple through systems I didn't fully understand. The rule wasn't simply cautionary, it was a barrier between the observed normalcy and the lurking instability of the platform itself. Moving along the upper deck, I noticed a pipe that appeared slightly out of alignment, its surface cold and unforgiving under the flashlight's beam. The air in the corridor shifted as though responding to my observation, carrying subtle vibrations that ran along the metal floor and railing. My breath caught as the platform seemed to settle slightly under my weight, reinforcing the sensation that my movements were under scrutiny. I fought the urge to correct the misalignment, remembering again the rule and feeling its weight as a boundary I could not safely cross. The machinery, innocuous by day, transformed at night into a landscape of risk and vigilance, demanding respect and obedience even when the danger was only hinted at. I paused near a cluster of gauges, their needles jittering subtly in a rhythm that felt almost purposeful, and crouched to check the base of the assembly. The metal was slick with condensation, and the surrounding shadows seemed to twitch slightly in response to my focus. Every instinct suggested minor interference could be harmless, but I resisted, anchoring myself in the rule. Rule 4. Never touch the machinery at night, unless absolutely necessary, even if it seems harmless had become more than words. It was a line between order and chaos, observation and interaction, safety and disaster. I felt the tension coil in my chest as I carefully edged away, flashlight steady, aware that the smallest mistake could ripple into consequences I could not predict. Near the stairwell to the lower maintenance deck, I noticed another subtle vibration, faint but insistent, and I crouched, shining the light along a series of valves and pipes that seemed to hum with quiet energy. The temptation to adjust a lever, to fix what looked slightly off, pressed against my willpower with surprising intensity. I forced my hands back to my pockets and exhaled slowly, letting my focus sharpen on observation rather than contact. The shadows bent slightly in unnatural ways, twisting along the walls and floors, and I realized that the machinery at night was more than metal. It was an environment that reacted, tested, and waited for human error. The rule kept me tethered, a lifeline amid the subtle invisible pressures of isolation. I moved cautiously toward the generator room, the deck beneath my boots humming faintly in response to the platform's systems. I scanned every valve, gauge, and pipe with my flashlight, noting how even the smallest shift in shadow or reflection could suggest hazard. My hands hovered near control panels, itching to adjust, but I clamped them into my pockets, forcing my attention back to inspection. Each step felt like negotiation with unseen forces, every vibration carrying potential consequences. The rule had become instinct, a mental thread that guided my every action, preventing rash movements that could destabilize machinery or invite the platform's quiet, patient attention. Finally, I reached the far end of the maintenance corridor, exhausted but precise, having avoided contact with every lever, valve, and switch, unless absolutely necessary. The shadows stretched across the deck, bending with subtle cues in the overhead lighting, and I realized that the platform itself seemed aware of my adherence to the rule. Every subtle shift in vibration, every imperceptible hum, was a reminder that compliance wasn't optional, it was survival. The machinery, though inert by daylight, transformed under isolation into something alive and responsive, and by following Rule 4, never touch the machinery at night, unless absolutely necessary, even if it seems harmless. I had kept a fragile line between myself and unseen consequences that might otherwise have found me unaware. Rule 5. Never enter restricted corridors alone, no matter how confident you feel. I learned this while checking the supply corridor near the upper deck. Flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed to lengthen unnaturally along the walls. At first, I thought I was overreacting. These were just maintenance paths, the same routes I had walked 100 times before, but something about the emptiness felt deliberate, almost anticipatory, as if the space itself was waiting to test my judgment. My boots echoed faintly, too steady, too synchronized, and I realized that walking alone made me more visible than I cared to admit. I murmured the rule to myself, letting it anchor my focus before I considered stepping further. The corridor walls felt tighter than usual, the pipes and conduits bending the light from my flashlight in strange patterns that suggested hidden depth where there was none. Each step made the floor vibrate subtly, and the quiet hum of the platform seemed to amplify around me. Shadows pooled in corners that had always been empty, and I could feel my pulse racing against the unnatural stillness. I tried to reason that it was just fatigue and isolation playing tricks on my senses, but my gut warned otherwise. Rule 5. Never enter restricted corridors alone. No matter how confident you feel reminded me that confidence was a liability, and isolation magnified the smallest misstep into a potential disaster. As I progressed deeper into the corridor, I noticed subtle differences in the air. A faint draft moved counter to the expected ventilation pattern, carrying metallic scents that I couldn't identify. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows stretched with deliberate intent, distorting angles and edges. I crouched momentarily to check a small panel, feeling the vibrations run up the railing and along the floor, aware that any movement could attract attention. My flashlight flickered once, then stabilized, but the change was enough to make me hesitate, questioning whether I should have come this far alone. The longer I stayed in the corridor, the more I became aware of imperceptible sounds, tiny taps, slight shifts in metal, a movement that might have been behind a wall or inside the shadows. My hands shook slightly as I adjusted my helmet light, scanning every corner, and I realized that moving alone made me prey to any unexpected presence. The corridors, normally mundane, now felt like extensions of something sentient, testing my decisions and patience. Each cautious step was guided by the memory of the rule, a mental tether reminding me that the smallest error here could have consequences that weren't immediately visible, but might linger far longer than I could anticipate. I paused near a junction that branched into a series of locked and semi-hidden doors, noticing how the shadows pooled at angles that didn't make sense. The temperature shifted subtly, and the hum of machinery carried differently through the metal framework. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the sensations, convincing myself that the platform's design caused the distortions, yet the isolation made every minor irregularity feel significant. I crouched to examine a panel that had been loose for weeks, resisting the urge to tighten it without a companion's backup. The rule once again guided my restraint, reminding me that confidence was no protection when faced with unseen variables. The flashlight beam illuminated a vent that seemed slightly ajar, and I crouched to inspect it, aware that the corridor amplified every minor sound. My pulse throbbed as I traced the edges, noting tiny scratches along the metal frame that I hadn't noticed before. Every instinct screamed that moving forward alone was dangerous, that I was too vulnerable to anticipate the platform's subtle warnings. I held myself still, counting breaths, letting the memory of the rule steady me against the growing tension that isolation invariably brought. Each flicker of shadow seemed like a question posed by the environment itself, and the rule anchored me against responding prematurely or recklessly. As I approached a corner that led to the supply alcove, I noticed how faint lights reflected differently along the walls, creating a pattern that suggested motion where none existed. The floor seemed to hum beneath my boots, a vibration almost imperceptible but consistent enough to unnerve me. I crouched to inspect a cable running along the edge of the deck, careful not to touch it unnecessarily, and reminded myself that Rule 5, never enter restricted corridors alone, no matter how confident you feel existed for a reason. Isolation amplified the consequences of every choice, and the corridor, quiet and unyielding, tested both nerve and attention, punishing misjudgment in subtle ways I was only beginning to understand. A few meters further, the corridor narrowed unexpectedly, and the shadows elongated into shapes that were almost tangible, pooling in corners that had never appeared threatening before. I slowed my steps, letting my flashlight sweep across each section, and the vibrations through the floor echoed like faint footsteps that weren't mine. My mind raced with possibilities, trying to rationalize them as electrical hums or draft effects, but the platform's silence suggested otherwise. I paused, holding my breath, letting my awareness stretch to encompass every detail, every subtle cue that might prevent a misstep. The rule anchored me, reminding me that entering alone was a gamble, one I had to navigate with precision. Near the end of the corridor, I crouched once more to examine a junction box that had a slight misalignment, noting how tiny changes in shadow and light could exaggerate perceived threats. Every instinct warned against touching or moving forward without a second set of eyes, and I obeyed, letting the rule dictate my choices. I traced each bolt, each panel, and every reflective surface with meticulous care, recognizing that even minor deviations could create hazards I couldn't anticipate alone. The corridor, empty and silent, seemed to pulse subtly with the weight of potential consequences, enforcing the rule in ways words never could. My awareness sharpened, senses straining under the tension that only isolation could create. Finally, I reached the alcove door, breathing slowly to calm the rising anxiety. Shadows clung to the walls, bending subtly in response to my flashlight, and I felt the platform itself watching, aware of my solo traversal. Every choice, every movement, every hesitation had been guided by the rule, a lifeline in the otherwise oppressive emptiness. I crouched, adjusting the beam to catch any irregularity, and understood that entering alone would have been a fatal mistake if I hadn't followed it. The tension in my shoulders remained, a lingering reminder of the dangers that isolation magnifies, and the rule etched itself permanently into my mind as a principle I could never ignore. Rule 6. Never ignore the changes in the platform's temperature. They signal unseen dangers. I realized this the moment I stepped near the generator room, where the air had shifted abruptly, warmer and thicker than I expected, despite the night's chill outside. At first, I brushed it off as an anomaly in the ventilation, a brief malfunction perhaps, but the hairs along my neck stood on end, and my instincts screamed that something was off. I crouched by a pipe to test the air with my gloved hand, noticing subtle waves that weren't consistent with normal machinery operation. My mind raced, connecting the sensation to previous nights, when minor thermal changes had preceded unexpected mechanical anomalies, and I repeated the rule softly to myself, letting it guide my heightened awareness. The temperature gradient grew more pronounced as I moved toward the storage deck, each step revealing slight pockets of warm or cold air that didn't match the airflow maps I had memorized. My flashlight illuminated walls and machinery, but the shifting heat made the metal feel alive, almost as if it were breathing beneath my hands. I hesitated, aware that the smallest change could indicate pressure imbalances, leaks, or even something more abstract, something I couldn't name. Every instinct pushed me to proceed cautiously, to notice and respect the rule. Rule 6. Never ignore the changes in the platform's temperature. They signal unseen dangers, anchoring my attention against the creeping unease that isolation always brings. Along the upper catwalk, the floor felt oddly warmer under my boots, and I realized that subtle vibrations accompanied the temperature shifts, creating an unsettling sensation of motion beneath me. Shadows bent and elongated as the lights reflected off heated surfaces, making familiar machinery appear distorted and alien. I crouched low near a valve cluster, testing each metal pipe for irregular warmth, noting that even minimal deviations demanded attention. The rule reminded me that survival wasn't about responding to obvious hazards alone. It was about noticing subtle environmental cues and trusting that the platform itself communicated danger in ways too small to ignore. Each change in heat carried weight far beyond what logic alone could predict. In the narrow corridor leading to the restricted maintenance bay, the air shifted again, colder this time, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach tighten. I paused, hand brushing against the railing, feeling the chill run along my arm and into my core. Shadows pooled differently in response to the temperature, elongating where the air felt heavier. My flashlight illuminated streaks along the walls, condensation forming in irregular patterns, and I realized that these minute signs were warnings I would be foolish to dismiss. Following the rule wasn't instinct anymore. It had become a conscious ritual, guiding each step, each observation, each deliberate act of restraint in the otherwise silent, isolating darkness. As I progressed to the lower deck, the temperature seemed to fluctuate in ways that defied natural explanation. Warm currents rose along the walls, cool patches lingered where none should have existed, and the hum of the platform seemed to shift with the air itself. I crouched to examine a junction box near the base of the catwalk, fingers grazing the metal, careful not to touch anything else. Every anomaly I noticed felt deliberate, almost purposeful, and my mind struggled to separate reality from perception. The subtle messaging of the temperature changes reinforced the rule's necessity, reminding me that even something as simple as air could carry potential threats in isolation. Near the generator, the heat intensified, pulsing subtly in a rhythm I couldn't initially identify. My flashlight beam swept across pipes, valves, and panels, each reflecting the change differently, creating distorted shadows that seemed to move independently. I crouched to test the air at several points, feeling the warmth shift and ripple in unpredictable ways. Each adjustment in my position revealed minor temperature discrepancies, as though the platform itself was alive, measuring my attentiveness. Rule 6. Never ignore the changes in the platform's temperature. They signal unseen dangers, reminded me that even the smallest oversight could have consequences beyond mechanical failure, and obedience felt more like survival than instruction. Walking along the storage bay, I noticed condensation forming in unusual streaks along the floor and walls, areas that should have remained dry. The temperature appeared to bend around my movements, pockets of warmth and cold alternating in dissonant patterns. My boots pressed against these surfaces, picking up subtle vibrations and pulses that made my stomach churn. I crouched to examine a valve that radiated heat inconsistently, noting the fine differences across its surface. Each shift became a tangible alert, a signal that ignoring minor variations could invite unexpected consequences in a place where isolation magnified danger and distorted perception. In the upper maintenance corridor, the temperature changes became more erratic, moving from cold drafts to sudden pockets of heat that made my breath quicken. I crouched near a series of pipes, shining my flashlight along them and tracing every anomaly with meticulous care. Shadows responded to these changes, stretching and twisting along the walls and floor as if testing my perception. My chest tightened as I noted every detail, understanding that the platform was not just machinery, but a dynamic environment that responded subtly to its occupants. Following the rule became instinctive, a mental tether in a place where the difference between perception and reality blurred in the night's isolation. At the stairwell leading to the generator access, I paused to measure airflow and warmth, noticing that the temperature seemed to ripple slightly along the railing, a faint, almost imperceptible movement against the metal. Each breath carried both warmth and chill as the currents shifted unpredictably, making my skin crawl. I crouched, flashlight sweeping along every surface, aware that the rule existed for a reason beyond mechanical safety. The platform, silent and watchful, seemed to respond to my vigilance, and I understood that ignoring even minor temperature shifts could allow hazards to develop unnoticed, threatening both machinery and my own stability. Near the control junction, I observed how the subtle air currents affected the reflections of the lights, bending them along panels and pipes in unusual ways. I crouched to inspect the surfaces, feeling both heat and cold in small, inconsistent pulses. Every movement required deliberation, as though the platform measured not only the air but my attentiveness to it. I reminded myself that Rule 6, never ignore the changes in the platform's temperature. They signal unseen dangers, letting the principle guide each step, each scan, each small adjustment in posture and focus. The tension built steadily, a quiet pressure amplified by isolation, forcing my attention to every detail. Finally, as I reached the far end of the maintenance corridor, the temperature shifts had become irregular and almost deliberate, subtle waves of warmth and cold pressing against the steel deck. I crouched to observe a junction valve, noting the small differences in heat across its surface, aware that a single lapse in attention could cascade into unpredictable results. The platform's silence pressed against me, thick and almost physical, as though the machinery itself was alive and observing my compliance. By the time I straightened, the lesson of Rule 6 had etched itself into my awareness, reinforcing the fragile thread that tethered survival to careful observation of even the subtlest environmental changes. Rule 7. Never underestimate the platform's silence. It can hide dangers you cannot anticipate. I realized this as I crept along the upper catwalk, the engines humming far below, the night pressing against the hull, and every step felt exaggerated in the quiet. At first, the emptiness was almost comforting, a deceptive calm that made the platform feel familiar, like a safe place despite the isolation. But the more I moved, the more I noticed how the silence accentuated everything. The slight hum of metal underfoot, the faint creak of a pipe settling, the subtle shift of air around a vent. I murmured the rule to myself, letting it remind me that even this stillness could mask hazards far more subtle and insidious than any visible threat. My pulse quickened, and I realized that the quiet wasn't empty. It was listening. I crouched to inspect a junction near the maintenance bay, noticing how the absence of sound made every small vibration feel amplified. A metal panel groaned faintly, and my mind instinctively tried to locate the source, but the silence made it impossible to tell whether it was mechanical or something else entirely. I adjusted my flashlight, scanning the area while remembering Rule 7. Never underestimate the platform's silence. It can hide dangers you cannot anticipate. Realizing that ignoring it would make me vulnerable in ways that the visible environment could not predict. The calmness of the platform was deceptive, a false reassurance that made me doubt my own perceptions. Each subtle creak or shift demanded full attention, because here, misjudgment could be catastrophic. As I moved further along the corridor, the silence began to feel oppressive, almost tangible, pressing against my ears and making every heartbeat sound unnaturally loud. The shadows seemed to stretch differently in the stillness, bending along walls and machinery, as if drawn toward the gaps in light. I crouched near a valve cluster, feeling the vibrations through the floorboards beneath me, and it struck me that even tiny changes could be missed if I became complacent. The isolation magnified each sensory detail, forcing me to trust instincts honed by repetition, by fear, and by rules that I had yet to fully understand. The silence, far from being empty, had a weight, a presence that made every movement deliberate and tense. Near the generator room, the stillness was more intense, swallowing the low hum of machinery and leaving only my breathing and cautious footsteps. I crouched to inspect a pipe, brushing a gloved hand along it to detect irregularities, but even that simple action felt like an intrusion into a dormant awareness. The platform's silence accentuated shadows and temperature shifts alike, making me hyper-aware of each detail that might otherwise go unnoticed. I realized that Rule 7, never underestimate the platform's silence, It can hide dangers you cannot anticipate, was not just caution. It was a lens, a way of filtering the subtle cues that the empty hum of isolation often masked. Even the absence of sound could be an indicator, a warning waiting to be interpreted. As I proceeded toward the restricted maintenance corridor, I noticed the floorboards creaked slightly under my boots, a sound that would normally go unnoticed, but now felt magnified in the surrounding quiet. Shadows seemed to linger in the corners longer than expected, and reflections off metal surfaces appeared sharper, almost deliberate. I crouched, keeping my flashlight close, scanning every pipe, valve, and panel for anomalies, knowing that in silence, the smallest oversight could escalate into catastrophe. Each careful movement reminded me that the absence of sound was not neutrality, it was tension, waiting to be tested by inattention or overconfidence. Observing the rule required patience, discipline, and a constant awareness of the invisible pressures around me. I paused near a junction that led to the upper storage decks, noticing how the stillness amplified minor anomalies, making tiny temperature changes and faint vibrations feel exaggerated. My heartbeat thudded in my chest, each pulse a reminder of the isolation, each footstep a potential alert to unseen eyes or forces. I crouched by a loose panel, shining my flashlight across the shadows that clung to the walls, realizing that the silence itself could conceal movement, subtle threats, or mechanical instabilities. The rule's words repeated softly in my mind, anchoring me against distraction, guiding me to move slowly, deliberately, and with heightened perception, understanding that in silence, error could escalate invisibly and instantly. Along the catwalk to the generator junction, the air shifted slightly, carrying an almost imperceptible scent of metal and brine, and the silence amplified it, making the platform feel alive with unseen intent. I crouched to examine a pipe, noting the subtle pulsation of heat and vibration running through it, each anomaly magnified by the quiet. Shadows leaned differently across the walls, reflecting light at unusual angles, and I realized that the lack of noise was itself a challenge, a layer of the platform that required careful reading. The rule reminded me that survival here relied on interpreting absence as much as presence, sensing what the silence concealed rather than what it revealed. In the storage bay corridor, the emptiness pressed against me like a physical force, and I crouched near a junction box, flashlight angled carefully to reveal every detail without disturbing the shadows. Every vibration through the deck, every subtle air movement seemed amplified, and I felt a creeping tension as if the platform itself was aware of my presence. The rule guided my movements, insisting I remain vigilant, even when no obvious danger existed. Rule 7. Never underestimate the platform's silence. It can hide dangers you cannot anticipate, became a mantra, a constant reminder that isolation and quiet were not allies but conditions that tested awareness, patience, and restraint. As I rounded the corner toward the upper maintenance corridors, the silence seemed to thicken, almost visible in the faint halo of my flashlight, pressing against the edges of my vision. Shadows pooled unnaturally in alcoves and around piping, and even the faintest air current seemed deliberate, exaggerated by the lack of background noise. I crouched, focusing my senses on minute anomalies, subtle vibrations, and fleeting glimpses of reflection, fully aware that any lapse could result in unseen consequences. The platform's stillness was an active participant, shaping perception and judgment, making obedience to the rule essential for survival in the oppressive isolation of the night. Near the far end of the catwalk, the shadows stretched unnaturally, bending over rails and along machinery, and the temperature shifted subtly, as if in concert with the silence. I crouched to inspect a valve cluster, tracing each edge and surface with meticulous care, understanding that the quiet magnified minor mistakes into hazards. The rule had become instinct, guiding every choice, every glance, every hesitant step. The platform was not simply empty, it was observant, responsive, and patient, its silence a warning that demanded respect and attention. By the time I stood to continue, the lesson of Rule 7 was clear. Even in stillness, the platform could conceal threats that would strike without warning, and only obedience to its subtle cues allowed me to navigate safely through the isolation. Rule 8. Never follow shadows or reflections that seem to move against the light. I discovered this while navigating the upper deck near the generator hall, flashlight in hand. Every reflection in the polished metal surfaces bending in ways that didn't make sense. At first, I thought it was fatigue, my eyes tricking me after hours of isolation, but instinct screamed otherwise. The shadows shifted subtly, not in sync with the light sources, creeping along walls and equipment as though observing, testing me. I crouched, adjusting my helmet light and squinting, reminding myself that curiosity here could be deadly. The rule echoed softly in my mind, anchoring me to the reality I could trust, forcing me to resist the temptation to pursue what the mind naturally wanted to chase. As I moved further down the catwalk, the reflections in the metal piping seemed to distort, forming shapes that bent contrary to my flashlight's beam. I paused, crouching to steady my breathing, realizing that even the slightest movement toward them could trigger consequences I could not anticipate. The platform was quiet, but the subtle visual distortions carried intent, a deliberate mismatch between perception and reality. My pulse raced as I forced myself to step backward slightly, letting my flashlight illuminate the shadows without chasing them. Rule 8. Never follow shadows or reflections that seem to move against the light, reminded me that the unseen forces here didn't need noise to manipulate fear. They only needed attention. Near the restricted maintenance corridor, a reflection flickered along the railings in a pattern impossible for a normal light source. I crouched, focusing on the metal surface, noticing how the movement contradicted the position of my own flashlight. My first instinct was to follow it, to see what it revealed, but I clenched my fists and shifted focus to the static environment around me. The rule wasn't about light, it was about survival, about trusting the tangible and resisting the instinctive pull toward anomalies that promised information but delivered danger. The reflections seemed almost sentient, bending, stretching, and teasing, but I reminded myself that to engage them was to invite unknown consequences. I continued along the corridor, careful not to glance toward the shadows pooling at the far edges of the deck. Each reflection seemed to respond to my attention, twisting independently, as if aware of my movements and my focus. The polished metal of the storage doors, normally dull, now carried streaks of light that defied logic, creating shapes and angles that shifted unnaturally as I approached. I crouched to inspect a valve cluster, deliberately avoiding the strange reflections, aware that Rule 8, never follow shadows or reflections that seem to move against the light, wasn't a suggestion, it was a rule forged from experience, necessary to prevent mistakes that could escalate beyond repair. My breathing slowed, but tension remained, a steady reminder that the platform's environment could distort perception in dangerous ways. Near the junction to the upper supply corridor, the shadows became more pronounced, their edges sharper and darker against the dim lighting. I crouched low to inspect a pipe, carefully tracing its length while keeping my flashlight on a neutral path, resisting the urge to investigate shapes that seemed alive. The silence of the platform amplified the effect, making the reflections feel purposeful, as if they were testing my reactions. I realized that every instinct to explore them could backfire, leading me into hazards I could neither see nor predict. My adherence to the rule kept me tethered to logic and caution, preventing impulsive actions that could be catastrophic in this isolation. Along the storage bay, the reflections in polished rails bent in impossible directions, forming angles that could not exist naturally. I crouched by a junction box, shining my light carefully, tracing the surfaces without letting my gaze follow the unnatural shapes. Every micro-movement of light seemed to shift in defiance of physics, a challenge to curiosity that I had learned to resist over time. The rule had become a survival tool, reminding me that the mind wants to chase patterns, but in this environment, obedience and restraint were the only paths to safety. Shadows and reflections were not to be trusted, no matter how logical it seemed to follow them, and the platform seemed to punish mistakes in subtle, invisible ways. In the generator hall, light refracted along the pipes, forming stretched shapes that twisted independently of my flashlight's movements. I crouched low, scanning the surfaces without turning toward them directly, letting my eyes track the stable, reliable features of the environment instead. Each distorted reflection tempted me, and each time I resisted, I felt a small relief, a reminder that restraint mattered more than curiosity. The shadows seemed to thicken, almost dense, bending along walls and floors in ways that contradicted the overhead lights. Rule 8. Never follow shadows or reflections that seem to move against the light anchored my focus, guiding me through the deceptive visual cues that isolation magnified. Near the stairwell leading to the lower decks, the reflections warped along the railing, appearing to ripple and twist as if alive. I crouched, breathing shallowly, keeping the flashlight steady on surfaces I could verify. Each pull of instinct toward these anomalies was countered by the rule, reminding me that survival depended on distinguishing what was real from what was fabricated by perception. The platform's quiet magnified the effect, making it feel almost deliberate, a test of focus and patience that I could not afford to fail. My hands tightened around my helmet, resisting the subtle compulsion to investigate what my mind insisted was moving independently. Along the corridor to the restricted maintenance bay, reflections bent around corners, briefly forming human-like shapes before dissolving back into distorted light. I crouched near a valve, flashlight angled precisely to avoid unnecessary illumination of the reflective surfaces. The urge to follow was palpable, but experience and the rule held me steady. I reminded myself that shadows and reflections were not passive, they were traps for attention, ways to lure even the most cautious into error. Obedience, not exploration, ensured I remained safe, and my focus sharpened, each micro-movement deliberate, each breath measured, each glance anchored in reality. Near the far end of the upper catwalk, shadows pooled unnaturally along the edges, and reflections in panels and pipes twisted independently of the light source. I crouched low, scanning the environment carefully, resisting the deceptive pull of movement that existed only in my perception. The platform seemed almost aware of my adherence, adjusting the distortions subtly in response to my attention. By the time I reached the junction to the storage deck, the lesson was reinforced. Curiosity here was dangerous, discipline was survival, and Rule 8. Never follow shadows or reflections that seem to move against the light was not negotiable. The night pressed in, stillness magnified, and the shadows remained, always just out of reach, waiting to test the next mistake. Rule 9. Never ignore the subtle vibrations beneath your feet. They can indicate far more than machinery. I felt it first along the upper catwalk near the generator room, a faint quiver in the metal deck that could have been dismissed as the platform settling. But my instincts screamed otherwise. My flashlight traced the edges of the railings and pipes, and I crouched, pressing a gloved hand to the steel to feel the tremor more clearly. Each pulse was uneven, irregular, carrying a rhythm that didn't match the normal thrum of engines or pumps. I whispered the rule to myself, letting it guide every movement, every careful adjustment, because I had learned that failing to heed such subtle cues could be catastrophic. As I moved further along the corridor, the vibrations shifted, spreading unpredictably beneath the deck plates, growing stronger in certain areas and fading in others. My boots pressed against the steel cautiously, adjusting with every pulse, aware that these tremors were signals, warnings, or perhaps even tests. The shadows stretched unnaturally in the dim flashlight beam, emphasizing the uneven surfaces and amplifying the sensations beneath my feet. I crouched again to examine a junction, letting the irregular quivers resonate through my fingers, and realized that these subtle pulses could precede events far more consequential than any visual anomaly. Rule 9. Never ignore the subtle vibrations beneath your feet. They can indicate far more than machinery became a lifeline, a method for navigating an environment that masked danger beneath ordinary appearances. Near the storage bay, the vibrations became more pronounced. Small but insistent, running along metal conduits in the floor plates in ways that didn't align with machinery patterns. I crouched low, flashlight angled to highlight every edge, every shadow, while I traced the source as best I could without touching the mechanisms. The platform's silence amplified each pulse, making the tremor feel almost alive, deliberate in its inconsistency. I reminded myself that observation, patience, and adherence to the rule were the only tools that separated caution from calamity. Any misjudgment could escalate into danger invisible to the eye, but undeniable beneath the feet. As I continued toward the restricted maintenance corridor, the quivers beneath the metal became rhythmic, subtle yet insistent, like a heartbeat I could feel through the soles of my boots. I crouched at a junction, noting how the vibrations shifted with movement in the air, light and shadows, forming a pattern that was almost intelligible if I could read it correctly. My pulse matched the tremors, each step carefully measured to avoid amplification or misinterpretation. The rule wasn't just a caution, it was a system for survival, a way of translating imperceptible warning signals into actionable awareness, letting me navigate the platform with the knowledge that some dangers were sensed rather than seen. Near the generator access, the vibrations intensified slightly, small tremors radiating outward from a section of piping that appeared ordinary in the flashlight's beam. I crouched, hand pressed lightly against the metal deck, feeling the subtle shifts in pressure and resonance as the air around me seemed to hold still. The shadows bent unusually around the machinery, elongating slightly, as though pulled by an unseen force, and I realized that the vibrations were connected to more than just mechanical operation. Rule 9. Never ignore the subtle vibrations beneath your feet. They can indicate far more than machinery guided my careful observation, ensuring that I registered every irregularity while maintaining distance from any part of the platform that might harbor unpredictable consequences. Along the catwalk toward the upper maintenance junction, the tremors fluctuated irregularly, pulsing in ways that didn't match any known engine frequency or structural settling. I crouched, flashlight sweeping across surfaces, observing the slight bends in pipes and reflections on panels that seemed accentuated by the vibrations. Every micro-movement underfoot required adjustment, deliberate care, and constant focus. I felt the weight of isolation pressing in, intensifying the sensations and making each tremor feel like a personal warning. The rule had become instinct, guiding my focus to sense hazards that weren't visible but could influence the platform in profound, unseen ways. In the storage bay corridor, the vibrations pulsed through the deck unevenly, subtle yet persistent, each step requiring caution to avoid misalignment or imbalance. I crouched near a junction box, flashlight tracing every line of shadow and metal, noting how the irregular tremors affected perception. The platform seemed aware of my presence, testing my response to the tremors, amplifying the psychological tension. Each subtle shift beneath my feet reminded me that the rule wasn't abstract. It was a lived principle, enforcing careful observation and mindful movement. Ignoring it would be a mistake. The platform could exploit without warning. Near the stairwell leading to the lower decks, the vibrations moved counterintuitively, seeming to travel against the direction of the machinery beneath. I crouched low, scanning the environment, letting the tremors inform my understanding of the space, mapping the invisible currents that ran beneath steel plates. My flashlight illuminated panels and rails without chasing shadows, keeping focus on the floor's subtle movements and the messages they carried. Rule 9. Never ignore the subtle vibrations beneath your feet. They can indicate far more than machinery had become, not just guidance but a survival code, a way to interpret the platform's hidden signals with precision. Each pulse was a whisper of caution, a signal I could not afford to miss. Along the upper catwalk, the tremors shifted unpredictably, moving in small waves that suggested motion in parts of the platform I could not see. I crouched, hand lightly on the metal, feeling the inconsistencies propagate beneath me, and adjusting my balance with every quiver. Shadows stretched differently in the dim flashlight light, bending along surfaces as though emphasizing the tremor's message. Each irregular pulse reminded me that the platform itself could harbor hazards unseen, and compliance with the rule allowed me to translate subtle feedback into safe navigation. Observation was the only safeguard, and the vibrations provided more information than sight alone ever could. Near the generator junction, the floor quivered in a pattern that seemed almost communicative, subtle changes that required acute attention to discern. I crouched, flashlight sweeping across surfaces, feeling each shift through my boots and legs, noting the correlation with temperature changes and shadow distortions. Every micro-vibration demanded a conscious response, an adjustment in pace, posture, and focus. Ignoring it would invite consequences I couldn't anticipate. The rule was not optional. Survival depended on interpreting what the eyes often missed, but the body could feel. Each step, each pulse, each subtle oscillation beneath my feet reinforced the principle that the platform communicated far more through vibrations than it ever did through visible signs. Finally, as I reached the far end of the maintenance corridor, the vibrations had become a constant, subtle presence beneath my boots, almost imperceptible yet impossible to ignore. I crouched, flashlight sweeping, noting the slight warps and bends in the shadows and reflections, letting the tremors guide my understanding of unseen threats. The platform, quiet yet insistent, seemed alive in the feedback of each pulse, every micro-vibration a signal of potential hazard. Rule 9. Never ignore the subtle vibrations beneath your feet. They can indicate far more than machinery. Was no longer just a caution. It was a method, a survival code, a way to navigate the unseen dangers lurking beneath my perception. Each careful step reinforced the fragile balance between attention and oversight, leaving me aware of the platform's hidden life in ways sight alone could never reveal. Rule 10. Never dismiss the warning lights. They often signal threats you cannot see. I realized this as I approached the upper control panels near the generator junction, the small blinking indicators casting an eerie glow along the metal deck. At first I told myself it was a routine malfunction, a minor alert I had learned to ignore during day shifts. But instinct screamed that the warnings were real. The lights pulsed in subtle patterns, some faster, some slower, and the differences didn't match any system I knew. I crouched, adjusting my flashlight, letting the rule guide my observations, because experience had taught me that ignoring these signals, even momentarily, could invite consequences invisible to the eye. The night pressed in around me, and I realized that the platform's communication was far subtler than I had ever imagined. As I moved along the catwalk toward the restricted maintenance corridor, the warning lights blinked intermittently across machinery, their signals inconsistent and unpredictable. I crouched near a junction box to trace each light's origin, trying to correlate the pulses with known systems, but nothing matched. Shadows stretched in strange angles across the walls, emphasizing the discord between the lights and their environment. Each blink seemed intentional, almost deliberate, forcing me to observe closely without making sudden movements. Rule 10. Never dismiss the warning lights. They often signal threats you cannot see, guided me, reminding me that each indicator was a potential alert to invisible hazards, a silent communication from the platform itself. Near the storage bay, a panel's red light flashed faintly, the intensity subtle but urgent. I crouched, scanning the surrounding pipes and machinery, trying to identify any anomalies that might explain the warning, but every surface appeared normal at first glance. The lights pulsed in a rhythm that did not match the humming of the engines, a discordance that made my stomach tighten. I resisted the impulse to ignore it, reminding myself that in isolation, even minor indicators could be crucial survival cues. The rule became a mental anchor, forcing me to consider each warning as potentially life-saving rather than a nuisance or malfunction, shaping my movements and focus along the deck. Moving along the upper deck corridor, the blinking lights shifted in intensity, some fading, others growing brighter, creating patterns that seemed almost communicative. I crouched near a valve cluster, shining my flashlight across the shadows, aware that these visual cues could be signaling conditions beyond my immediate perception. The vibrations in the metal beneath my boots resonated subtly, in tandem with the lights, creating an unsettling rhythm that demanded attention. Rule 10. Never dismiss the warning lights. They often signal threats you cannot see, reminded me that the platform communicated in ways beyond the obvious, and obeying the signals required more than sight, it required focus, patience, and respect for the environment's subtleties. As I approached the stairwell to the lower maintenance bay, the warning lights on the panels blinked in a pattern that contradicted my expectations, almost as if reacting to my movements. I crouched, carefully mapping each light to its corresponding machinery, noting the inconsistencies and irregularities in pulse. Shadows bent unnaturally along the walls and floors, reflecting the lights in ways that confused perception, making the environment feel alive. Ignoring the signals was not an option. They carried information that the naked eye could not decode without attentive observation. My adherence to the rule ensured that I moved deliberately, scanning both light and shadow for hidden cues, every micro-decision guided by the warnings before me. Near the generator room, a row of amber lights flashed intermittently, highlighting small panels I had previously considered unimportant. I crouched low, flashlight angled to avoid unnecessary glare, tracing each pulse with my eyes, noting subtle vibrations that seemed synchronized with the warning indicators. Each blink suggested anomalies in airflow, pressure, or structural integrity, but the platform's isolation amplified their significance beyond mechanical concerns. The rule became instinct, a mental filter allowing me to interpret the light's subtle messages without succumbing to distraction or panic. Observing them closely, I realized that ignoring even one could create ripple effects that I might not recognize until it was too late. Along the upper storage deck, small red and yellow lights flickered against the metal walls, casting irregular shadows that danced independently of my flashlight beam. I crouched near a junction, noting each blink, correlating its frequency with environmental changes around me, the shifting shadows, the faint vibrations, the subtle temperature shifts. Rule 10, never dismiss the warning lights. They often signal threats you cannot see became a mantra, reminding me that the platform's communications were multi-layered, subtle, and potentially life-saving. Compliance required focus, patience, and deliberate interpretation of the unseen, a mental discipline that became more critical with each step through isolation. As I progressed down the corridor toward the restricted access zones, the blinking lights intensified, some appearing and disappearing in sequences that defied mechanical logic. I crouched to inspect panels that might have triggered the warnings, tracing wiring and checking gauges, but each system seemed normal on the surface. The lights pulsed against shadows in ways that made the environment feel almost sentient, a subtle reminder that the platform's warnings were not to be ignored. Following the rule demanded that I balance observation, patience, and careful deduction, resisting the impulse to dismiss minor alerts as trivial or malfunctions. In the lower deck near the supply corridor, the warning lights flashed faintly along machinery I had previously inspected, their intermittent signals now impossible to ignore. I crouched low, shining my flashlight across the surfaces, carefully observing each subtle vibration in tandem with the blinking indicators. The silence of the platform magnified their impact, emphasizing their importance beyond simple mechanical function. Each micro-blink reminded me that survival relied on understanding signals often invisible to the eye and imperceptible to intuition alone. The rule dictated restraint, observation, and respect for the unseen forces the platform communicated through these lights. Near the far end of the catwalk, the red and amber warnings pulsed in a sequence that seemed almost deliberate, guiding my attention to areas I might otherwise have overlooked. I crouched near a junction box, flashlight illuminating every edge and reflection, interpreting the patterns while avoiding any impulsive interaction. The vibrations in the deck, subtle temperature changes, and distorted shadows reinforced the message, creating a layered set of cues that demanded attention. By observing the rule closely, Rule 10, never dismiss the warning lights. They often signal threats you cannot see. I navigated the corridor safely, translating visual signals into actionable awareness, recognizing that in this isolation, compliance with subtle cues was far more critical than any visible hazard. Finally, as I reached the junction to the upper maintenance corridors, the warning lights pulsed faintly but insistently, each blink a reminder that danger often existed beyond perception. I crouched, scanning the shadows, pipes, and panels illuminated by the alternating glow, interpreting every minor anomaly in conjunction with the signals. The rule had become instinctive, guiding my decisions and movements through the quiet, isolated environment. Observing the blinking lights, I understood that the platform communicated continuously, invisibly, and subtly, and that survival depended on heeding these signals without dismissal. Each pulse reinforced the fragile line between awareness and oversight, leaving me alert, tense, and obedient to the platform's warnings. Rule 11. Never respond to voices or whispers that seem to come from nowhere. I heard it first in the upper maintenance corridor, faint and barely distinguishable beneath the hum of the platform's machinery, almost teasing me with familiarity. At first I thought it was fatigue, the isolation fraying my nerves until imagination filled the silence, but the cadence was deliberate, too structured to be mere invention. I crouched, flashlight angled toward the walls, trying to trace its origin while keeping my voice unraised. The whispers didn't belong to anyone I could see. An instinct screamed that acknowledging them could draw consequences invisible and irreversible. The sound shifted subtly as I moved along the catwalk, almost following me, growing sharper in areas where shadows pooled unnaturally. I crouched to examine a pipe joint, trying to steady my breathing, aware that the air itself seemed to carry the murmurs, twisting in rhythm with my steps. Every instinct urged me to answer, to speak, but the rule anchored me in restraint, reminding me that obedience was a matter of survival here. The platform's isolation magnified the deception, making the whispers appear to come from multiple sources at once. Ignoring them was the only safe response, though the human need to respond screamed louder with every passing moment. Near the generator hall, the whispers became clearer, repeating fragmented words I couldn't quite understand, sometimes mimicking my own thoughts or recalling events that hadn't occurred. I crouched low, flashlight tracing shadows along the deck, the tremors beneath my boots responding faintly, as though echoing the voices. I reminded myself again that Rule 11, never respond to voices or whispers that seem to come from nowhere, was essential. Any engagement could invite unseen consequences. The platform's machinery hummed, indistinguishable from the cadence of the whispers, blurring the line between mechanical resonance and something else entirely. The longer I stayed, the more the whispers seemed aware of my compliance, adjusting their rhythm in subtle, unnerving ways. In the restricted maintenance corridor, the whispers thickened, layering over one another, each one faint but distinct, suggesting presence in spaces where none existed. I crouched by a junction box, flashlight careful not to reflect across surfaces that might distort perception further. My mind struggled to separate reality from hallucination, to distinguish between the mechanical hum, temperature shifts, shadows, and these auditory anomalies. Each whisper carried a rhythm that didn't match machinery, and I felt the isolation sharpen its effect, making the rule my only tether. Responding in any way would be reckless. Staying silent became an act of survival, a recognition that obedience was the only shield against unseen influence. As I proceeded along the catwalk, the whispers seemed to move ahead of me, subtle pauses and inflections suggesting a presence navigating the corridors invisibly. I crouched low, flashlight sweeping carefully along walls and panels, noting slight vibrations beneath my boots and irregular reflections in metal surfaces. The combination of these environmental cues and the whispers heightened my senses, forcing extreme vigilance. The platform was alive with signals both visible and auditory, and the rule reminded me that responding to voices could blur perception, leading to mistakes in judgment that might be permanent. I felt the weight of isolation pressing against me, the unacknowledged whispers shaping my awareness as surely as the floor beneath my feet. Near the upper storage bay, the whispers grew sharper, mimicking faint echoes of my own breathing, layering confusion over instinct. I crouched to inspect a panel, shining my light across shadows that seemed denser, bending unnaturally. The tremors beneath my boots resonated with the cadence of the whispers, almost as if the platform itself were collaborating with the phenomenon. Rule 11. Never respond to voices or whispers that seem to come from nowhere, repeated silently in my mind, guiding restraint against the impulse to answer, speak, or acknowledge the sounds in any way. The longer I remained silent, the more tenuous the boundary between perception and hallucination became, yet compliance with the rule allowed me to navigate without surrendering to deception. In the generator access corridor, the whispers seemed to come from vents, panels, even the metal deck, moving with intent through spaces I could not see. I crouched low, flashlight scanning carefully, careful not to disturb shadows that might react to movement. Each layer of sound was deliberately ambiguous, faint enough to be doubted yet structured enough to provoke anxiety. The platform's isolation magnified the effect, creating a sensation that the environment itself was communicating beyond visual cues. Obedience to the rule required, ignoring the urge to respond, forcing focus on tangible, observable signs instead of engaging with phenomena beyond comprehension. Along the upper catwalk to the restricted areas, the whispers shifted into rhythm with subtle temperature fluctuations and vibrations beneath my boots. I crouched low, aware that every instinct to respond could amplify danger in ways invisible yet perceptible to the environment. Shadows stretched unnaturally, reflections twisted, and the air seemed to carry the whispers along hidden channels. The rule had become a survival compass, the one principle that allowed me to move safely through the deceptive sensations and layered anomalies that isolated night created. Every whispered syllable carried the potential to disorient or manipulate if I broke the silence, a constant reminder of obedience as protection. Near the stairwell to the lower maintenance deck, the whispers grew almost coherent, forming faint fragments of words that tugged at memory, recognition, and fear simultaneously. I crouched, flashlight sweeping across pipes and panels, aware that the tremors, shadows, and subtle light distortions were all interlinked with these auditory signals. Compliance with Rule 11, never respond to voices or whispers that seem to come from nowhere, was no longer just advice. It was instinctive behavior, reinforcing every cautious decision I made in isolation. Each ignored prompt strengthened my awareness, keeping me anchored to what could be measured, seen, or felt tangibly, rather than what the mind wanted desperately to engage. Finally, at the far end of the upper maintenance corridor, the whispers seemed to converge, layering over one another, following my movements with impossible precision. I crouched low, flashlight illuminating the metal deck and shadowed walls, aware that the subtle tremors beneath my feet, the blinking lights, and the air currents all interacted with the disembodied sounds. Ignoring them, observing silently, and maintaining obedience to the rule allowed me to navigate past what could have been fatal engagement. The environment seemed alive, responsive, and patient, testing compliance, perception, and focus in ways I could not anticipate. And then I stopped, flashlight lingering on a shadow that shifted slightly, and the whispers ceased as abruptly as they began. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.